每种你以为你是大牌，你以为干嘛又来？我的事，我的命，我的现在我要说。受够了，受够了，想透了，受够了，上的够了，就是够了。受够了，别回头了，受够了，想透了，受够了，上的够了，我说够了。犯了什么错？你说你知错，希望我记过，我该怎么做？心中矛盾，我期望摆脱三番四次你重复压迫，希望你知道我到底有多少次其实忍受难过。朋友说过你人心堕落，我却让事实闪过。你在眼前，我当谎言说心中要过，每天以泪洗面，感觉自己懦弱，做了那么多，经过多少弹错，我没在你人性突破，还是算了吧，该丢了吧，用不着藏在心里忍受。对牛弹琴，终究是为了什么？你以为你是大牌，你以为干嘛又来？我的事，我的命，我的现在我要说。
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to the Road to Social Impact Filmmaking panel with the Philadelphia Asian American Film Festival. I'm Oanh-Nhi Nguyen, and I'll be moderating this awesome conversation with Betty Yu, Gary Leonard, and Jamie Wu. Welcome. I would love to invite everyone to ask questions, comment on the chat panel. You can share where you're from, how many years in film you've been, what's your interest in social impact filmmaking. We will also have a Q&A 15 minutes before we end, so we hope to answer most of your questions then. But if you have relevant questions, we may also be able to ask during our panel conversations. So before we start our conversation, we'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. Though we're currently conducting this panel in a virtual space, the Philadelphia Asian American Film Festival hosts its events on the unceded indigenous territory known as Lenape-Hogan, the homeland of the Lenni Lenape. These are the people who negotiated with William Penn in the 1680s to facilitate the founding of the colony of Pennsylvania. Their descendants today include the Delaware tribe and Delaware Nation, Oklahoma, Nanticoke, Lenni Lenape, Ramapo Lenape, and Powhatan Lenape, New Jersey, and then Muncie, Delaware, Ontario. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you to our amazing panel today for saying yes on a Sunday. I'm Oanh-Nhi Nguyen, she, her, hers. I'm a Vietnamese American woman, daughter of immigrants. I'm a consultant, writer, director, producer. I'm currently producing and directing a documentary with Viet Lead on Southeast Asian resettlement histories and stories in Philadelphia. I also write stories about the diaspora, intergenerational healing, trauma, and warrior women. So I would love to give the floor to our amazing panelists to share more about who they are before we get to our questions. Who would like to start?
I can go ahead and get started. I was waiting for someone else to go before me, but first of all, thank you, PAF, for organizing this panel. Everyone, all the programmers who helped bring all the panelists here, and thank you, Oanh-Nhi, for moderating. My name is Gary Leonard. My pronouns are he, him. I also want to acknowledge, although I know it's not enough, that I am joining from the traditional ancestral unceded territory of the Muncie Lenape and Canarsie, also known as Brooklyn, New York. I am an impact producer, community organizer, and I also work for an organization called Working Films. We are a US-based nonprofit organization that leverages the power of documentary film and storytelling as a resource for social justice movements. So essentially what we do is we bring the world of documentary filmmaking and social justice together, and we support doc filmmakers through strategy, partnership development, and funding. We are now in our 21st year. And I direct the Docs in Action and Impact Kickstart funds at Working Films that supports the completion and touring of short docs and the impact campaigns specifically for underrepresented filmmakers. We also have work specifically around supporting organizers, Black and Brown organizers and rural leaders to be able to leverage film as a part of their work. And then also much of our work is on the filmmaker services side. Not to get too deep into it, but I'll just start off by saying that in all of our work, we do prioritize accountability, non-oppressive, non-extractive practices, and also working to embody that internally within our organization, as well as our programmatic work that includes our funding practices, support for underrepresented filmmakers, and organizers leveraging film as a part of their work. And I'm excited to dig into this panel. Thank you.
Betty, would you like to go next?
Sure, I was also waiting. It's like someone else can jump in. So my name is Betty Yu. I use she, her pronouns. I am also calling in from the ancestral unceded territory lands of Lenape, and Canarsie was an ethnic group within the Lenape nation. So yes, it's absolutely vital to always remind ourselves of that. And any of the justice work we do, we must remember who have been one of the most impacted groups on this land. And, yes, decimated and genocide, but people are still fighting and thriving and fighting on their homelands. So the way I would like to describe myself, and I'll just kind of keep it short because I know there's a lot of questions and it'll be like a really fruitful conversation. But I am a multimedia artist, filmmaker, photographer, and activist, born and raised in New York City to Chinese immigrant parents from Hong Kong by way of China. And I integrate documentary film, new media, and community approaches and practices into my work. I also co-founded in 2015 Chinatown Art Brigade, and it's a cultural collective using art in media and culture to advance anti-gentrification organizing, and specifically working with folks who are directly impacted and most impacted by gentrification. In the case of Chinatown, it's monolingual immigrant Chinese-speaking folks who are really fighting the big fight, the real estate developers and the city government that has really caused this massive displacement. I also teach at a number of places. So I teach like film, media, and activism at Pratt, Hunter College, and also at New School. So I can kind of speak to the art and activism piece even more generally. But I think more recently, my work in the last couple of years has moved away from long form documentary and more to short form. And I can explain why. And it's directly coming from the, at least the organizations and social movements I work with in New York City, kind of the need for more short sort of impact pieces, and also moving more into new media and other ways to actually engage folks who are not going to be in the festival circuit, right, or watch PBS, right, but look really on the ground in the community. So I'll just end there, and I'm also very excited to dig in.
Well, I would love to like somehow audit your classes, Betty. So that sounds amazing. How fun is that? That's fabulous. Really, really wonderful to be with all of you. My name is Jamie Wu. I use she, her pronouns. And I am a senior development producer at Culture House, which is a Black, Brown, and woman-owned production company we do film and TV. And we're really looking at pushing the envelope with regards to sitting at the intersection of pop culture and politics. And so really amplifying his systematically excluded voices, their stories, their narratives, all while using an entertainment first lens. And then in a part-time capacity, I am a DEI or diversity, equity, and inclusion facilitator and consultant, where I work on helping to create inclusive work environments for a variety of different clients, whether in the corporate space, nonprofit space, academia, et cetera. And before this work, I had a whole other career in community organizing and politics, more specifically. Moved out to LA from Washington, D.C., where I was working on gender violence prevention issues for then Vice President Biden in the Obama administration. Following that was a communications director on Capitol Hill for Congressman Lloyd Doggett, who represents parts of Austin and San Antonio. And while there, strangely and sadly, was the only Asian female communications director in all 435 offices of the US Congress, which when I left was 0. So hopefully in the last 3 years, it's changed since then. But that to me was also a reminder of how important representation is, not only, on screen, but also those in, decision-making power. And so that's kind of the lens through which that I come to this work, specifically as we talk about social impact producing. So really excited to be with you all, and yeah, excited to get started. Back to you, Oanh-Nhi.
Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, y'all. This is a powerful group, just gotta say. I think what's making me really grateful is just to hear your community organizing activist background. I think, for me, that was a huge influence to why I'm a filmmaker again today. So I'd just love to hear from each of you, like, how has community organizing impacted or influenced the stories that you tell today? Let's see, Jamie, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think, at the end of the day, the work that we're doing needs to honor and reflect reality. And in order to actually understand what that is, we need to talk to the communities on the ground that are experiencing the realities that we're portraying, right? And for me, I started my career as a community organizer working on economic justice campaigns. And so, which is a very meaty topic. I actually specialize mostly in tax issues, which is like people say like, oh, like tax fairness, your eyes glaze over. It's like not the most sexiest topic, but it really has driven a lot of economic disparity, particularly for BIPOC populations and communities. And so, in order to actually move the needle in cultural landscape through our filmmaking and storytelling, we need to be organizing with and working in solidarity with those on the ground and those who are experiencing every day. Because I think there's a real harm in going in a place and then basically using it from our own lens to tell a story for our own good and for our own profits, right? Like, this is the opportunity for us to like empower those that are on the ground. And that means bringing them into the decision-making when it comes to actually filmmaking. And yeah, so I'll leave it to Betty and Gary, who have done far more work on the ground than I have, to finish out that question.
I can jump in, Betty. I certainly want to hear what you have to say. But for me, I think community organizing has greatly impacted just like the way in which Working Films and myself personally kind of we work with film. I think so much about building out impact campaigns is rooted in community organizing and really base building. So at the end of the day, what we oftentimes say is like you're organizing with film. And so it's important to think about storytelling as a form of healing and relationship building. I think for many underrepresented stories and underrepresented filmmakers, individuals that are telling stories about their communities, it's an opportunity to see yourself on screen, reclaim whatever agency and power that society has maybe told you otherwise. Given that I am an organizer, I'm also an abolitionist. So I think that I believe that we need to build new systems and new ways of being in relationship with each other and in the world. And I think so much about that building that future to be more equitable is kind of that relationship piece, and to kind of quote Adrienne Marie Brown around moving at the speed of trust. So I think for all of us, regardless of where we are and kind of the role that we play within like film and impact work, I think it's just something for us to think about, that regardless of the power that you hold, or the proximity to privilege and power that you have, thinking about the incremental changes that you can make that goes a long way towards healing systemic oppression and inequities, and that would go a long way to kind of rebuild trust that I think has long been fractured by institutions and individuals and communities. So really when we work with film and we're thinking about impact campaigns, it's not so much about those kind of didactic ways of raising awareness and lifting up consciousness. What for us, we're really trying to go beyond that. And so we're trying to create long-term sustainable like root issue change, and so much of that is about changes in conditions of those who are directly impacted. And so making sure that the subjects and the communities that are featured in the film have a voice, to be able to be centered as part of that conversation throughout an impact campaign. What are the ways in which they are able to kind of think about impact campaigns of a form of collective liberation and movement building and even mutual aid? And not to kind of get into like this like really jargony, I just think there's an opportunity as we're thinking about organizing with film to actually really work towards changing kind of the narrative, as like true telling is centered by those who are telling their own stories. So I think there's myriad ways of being able to do that through grassroots organizing and policy advocacy. But for us, it's just making sure that we are centering those that are directly impacted by these issues as part of like creating socially impactful films.
Yeah, great discussion. I love that. I'm just like marveling at people's your responses. So the way I would like to answer this actually is I started out as an activist organizer, since I was not going to age myself, but since I was a teenager, and I had no choice in the matter. Right? My parents were garment workers working really long hours for low pay, as many tens of thousands of other immigrant workers in the city were working restaurant, service jobs or garment at the time. And I was seeing this sort of growing movement for labor rights, especially led by immigrant workers. My sister was involved, my mom was involved. And so I got involved as a teenager and then became a full-time organizer, doing a lot of this labor immigrant rights work. And all along, I was also involved with video production, but more from the standpoint out of necessity, because the Chinese newspapers in Chinatown are all four dailies are very pro-employer, pro-boss, and at the time, really controlled by the Tongs, meaning the organized crime families that were in cahoots with the local precincts, the employers, right? Very, very not favorable to the everyday working person in Chinatown. And so the video production that we had a public access show, we had a newsletter, so all these forms of media way before the internet, like talking, in the mid-late 90s, these were essential tools for telling people stories, right? Because the dominant narrative was that Chinese people or Asian people were happy slaves. In fact, there was a New York Times article written by a Chinese journalist, who said she went into a garment factory and she witnessed people braiding each other's hair, and it was this ethnic enclave. It was so beautiful, right? All this kind of stuff. And so to really kind of counter the happy slave or happy worker or docile worker kind of image of Chinese Americans, of Chinese immigrants, it was really important. So the media piece of storytelling in our own hands, in the hands of an intergenerational group of workers, like documented, undocumented, young, old, was really essential to getting their stories out there. So kind of that's kind of how I started, and then was inspired to study film in college. And then I had a kind of a weird path. I was continuing to organize, but then realized that I was no good at direct community organizing. I have so much respect for it, but my skill is actually in as a media maker, as a multimedia maker, image maker, in telling people stories through media. And I think media and culture, as we all have kind of been saying, is like so integral because art in general allows us to kind of imagine I hate to say utopia, but an ideal society where we're on the other side of this dystopia, right? Like where we can actually unleash our own imagination of what is possible. And art, culture, and media can do that in such amazing ways, where it allows us to separate ourselves from this racialized capitalist society we live in. But, I think about what Jeff Chang, who I'm inspired by his writings, but he talks a lot about cultural change precedes political change. And he just talks about culture, changing culture, right? And how arts and culture and us as artists and filmmakers have this positionality in society to really win hearts and minds in ways that somebody might not have, might not even be open to having a discussion on a certain controversial topic. So, I can talk a little bit more about my own kind of some of the examples, but I would say for me that those two are inseparable. As a artist, as a multimedia, social engaged artist, I community principles and accountability, mutuality are like can't be separated from me as who I am, because I actually started out doing that work, and I continue to do that work in my various creative projects. So
Totally. Thank you, everybody. I think about like the word like social impact, and it feels uncomfortable to me because I'm like, what does that even mean? Because it seems like extractive or like external. So like just hearing what y'all have to say, that like kind of redefining it. Like Betty, you're saying like this is my life. This is I just didn't just jump into it. This impacted my life. And Gary's saying how like storytelling is healing. It's for collective liberation, and Jamie about like shifting power and centering our voices in our lives. Is there any other ways y'all would like redefine social impact for like folks who are just like new to this work or are interested?
I just want to add one thing that, based on what Gary and Betty are saying, that I think is such a sticking point, which is being aspirational about what we want this world to look like, and that our stories can bring us there, right? So I think when we talk about like the storytelling that we're doing, sometimes we say a lot in the past, which I think is so important, right? We have to have the historical context to inform where we are today, but we don't do enough of being forward thinking, right? Like, what could we get to, and how can we collectively get there together, right? And so I think that's also a really unique part of storytelling, because we can use our imagination through that, right? Where you can really get creative about, as Gary was saying, like the types of systems that we want to recreate and, completely rebuild. And so I think that's a really key part of the storytelling, and how it relates to the, quote unquote, social impact space.
I'll actually say one more thing. I think there has been this ongoing conversation in terms of what it means to redefine impact. And I think for us to be able to kind of pull that back and reclaim that for what we want it to look like, I think for filmmakers and storytellers and artists, etc., like, you do not need to be defined by your impact through a grant or funding or anything else. I think there's a real opportunity, not so much just about the racial reckoning that happened 2 summers ago and kind of where we are in terms of this like decolonized mindset, but I just think for us of like, what does it mean to like be organizing and kind of be like building movements with one another through this form of collective liberation? I think about documentary films from like the early onset was so much through this really anthropological frame of kind of extraction and kind of telling the story for those who aren't aware of this community or these individuals that are impacted by these issues. And I think for Black and brown folks and other marginalized, groups, it's an opportunity to kind of shift away from the quote unquote white gaze. And so I think so much about like what we're doing in terms of thinking about audience is thinking about like what it is for us, right? Like, how does it like really change our landscape, and how does it change our worlds, and like what does that look like to really lean into this like real relationship building? And with Working Films, we've been a part of this group called the Documentary Accountability Working Group. And for me, I think there's kind of this extension around like the impact, the socially impact films. And I think there's kind of this extension around how we are framing the relationship that we have to the subjects within our films, and kind of leaning like deeply into the power around like relationship building. And I think for filmmakers, they're the culture bearers, right? The creators that are helping shift the narrative. Its ability to kind of translate those stories and experiences that makes them accessible and visible in so many ways. And I think, that key component around relationship building, I think some of the best films that we see, you can kind of see that like really deep relationship where like the director has kind of this like, this not only this deep trust, but this like this real passion to be able to kind of change like and amplify kind of what's happening on screen. And I just like, I see that as a real kind of turning point right now as we are talking about redefining impact, of just kind of shifting away from like, I think how stories are thought about being told around like, okay, we're going to raise consciousness around this because we are trying to teach, a white audience to understand about these our issues. And I think it's becoming less of that. And it's more about like, this is unapologetically like by us and for us. And what does it mean for like our people? And I just see that more and more. And yeah, I'm just really excited about that shift in terms of being able to kind of redefine what impact looks like.
Yeah, ditto, check on what Carrie and Jamie was saying. Just to add on to that, because I don't want to repeat all the great things that were said. Social impact, yeah, that term bothers me. I'm not sure what exactly why, it bothers me, but I do think it goes back to, I think who's setting the metrics, right, for measuring success. Yeah. And oftentimes it's external it's you want to fit into this narrow box of like what POV, or independent lens deems as screenable, or a festival or a funder. And so really challenging like who, like that part of it, and also what are our goals. And so for me, it's not just about, I think folks have talked about it already and we'll probably get into it, but in terms of impact, it's not like an afterthought, like, oh, I'm just gonna make something and then I'll say, oh yeah, I'm gonna do this community-based distribution because now that's a sexy thing and I know I have to engage with communities, right? But from the get-go, before you even turn on the camera, how are you really thinking about that? But not in a piecemeal way that is performative. And so it's about sitting down with folks, right? Like the communities that are most directly impacted that you are filming or you're documenting, or however they're engaging with the creative process. That it's not just that they're being you're not just using, you're not just documenting their stories, but like moreover, how are they part of that creative production process? And I think that sadly, honestly, a lot of people know what to say, but when you ask them, how are they really part of the cultural production piece of it, it's very shallow. And I think that, everything from the crew, is the crew made up of the people who are your direct, not that it always should be, but I mean, even in politics, in race and in gender and that kind of gender identity, all those things matter. Where are you hiring from? Are you hiring from the local community? A lot of people say, sometimes I hate that, when people say, well, they'll ask me for a recommendation of somebody somewhere, and I'm just, they're like, oh, well, we ended up going with this white guy, right, cinematographer, because we couldn't find anyone. I'm like, that is not true. That you're lazy, you didn't do your work. And then in terms of the production, the post-production, all of that, I feel like that piece of it needs to be driven by the community, and what are the goals. So when we talk about impact, who's driving it, who's dictating it, and how collective is that visioning process, I guess. Those are really important things to ask yourself rather, as a maker, or yourselves as producers and as a collective body. So yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I love that. I feel like also, like, sometimes like thinking about filmmaking, social, I want any new word for that. Maybe like, I don't know, imaginative collective liberation filmmaking.
There you go.
But yeah. Sometimes I'm just thinking about folks who are just starting or want to really, have the right intentions or relationships, but don't know where to start. And it's not a list though, right? It's a way of being, like being self-aware, like understanding the powers, dynamics. And like it is a journey it's like also a healing journey for ourselves. So I'm just curious for like each of you, where think back to when you were just getting started. What was like a conversation or a lesson that you learned along the way that really led you to this path? And I'll let anybody, like maybe you look like you're thinking, so I'm just gonna wait to whoever wants to share first. Hey, Betty, you're like shaking your head. No. Jamie.
Can you state the question one more time? I'm so sorry.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, I'm just thinking that this is like a trajectory, this is a journey, right? I'm thinking about an emergent filmmaker who's like, okay, so how do I do that? But it's also a way of being. So I'm thinking of like any past relationships or lessons you learned along the way that really influence who you are today to being this filmmaker, the filmmaker you are today.
I can jump in. I don't know if I'm I'm directly answering the question that you're posing, but it's something that is just really coming up for me, that has felt like a really important part of this ongoing journey as I continue to work with incredible film teams around their partnership and strategy development, but also being able to like be in a position where we're getting to fund like really incredible films. But through Working Films, our Impact Kickstart program, again, as just mentioned, we provide specifically support and funds, our impact campaign funds for underrepresented filmmakers. And just thinking about like shifting away from kind of this deficit mindset towards this one of abundance around like there's actually like there's support out there, and just like how much of a game changer that can be. And like she's okay with me specifically bringing this up, but we worked with the film team for an upcoming feature called Little Sally Walker. Marta Effinger Krishlaw is the director, and it's specifically around like play as a lifeline for Black girls and Black women. And it's just been such like a really transformative process working with them and continuing to see this this evolution and this like, film come to life, from where we started. And, we did the thing that I know a lot of, impact campaigns start around in terms of building out, like some call it a brain trust, others call it a strategy summit, where you're able to bring partners on board. And for this one, I think it was just really special. In this current moment that we exist in terms of just like racialized violence, and anti-blackness, of being able to see like, Black women and come together around this idea and concept of a film, and talk about something as like that seems like trivial to us, as like play. Like we're talking about play, and something that is, I think, like really robbed from a lot of people in their life, in terms of like, the way into society is just forcing you to grow up. And so anyway, to kind of pull it back towards like, my experience working with this, I think, one of the most special moments having worked on this film is like, it's not, it's like, yes, the impact and everything that, each one of us is saying in terms of how this is going to create an impact in the world for people to be able to engage with it. But it's also, I think, just like the creative process within the overall like film team and the production team and those featured in it, and just like how so many of those spaces are just used in a form of just like seeing each other, making sure that folks are being taken care of. These are not hard, these are not easy times right now. And I think for so many, creators and filmmakers, like they're pouring their selves and like their identities, and like it's so much like focused within that lens. And just like, and I just think about like, the overall like process around like, filmmaking and distribution and impact. It's like, this is this is like, yes, it's work, but it's also a form of just like an extension of both organizing, but also just like healing, and just being able to be in space with comrades and people, and just to be able to make sure that like folks are okay. And so I think for me, having worked in just like, I've done a bunch of like community organizing as well as like policy advocacy, and like my own like personal theory of change. I just think it's like really important for us to make sure that we are talking about like narrative, and just like the way that like storytelling is so crucial. And so for me, I'll kind of I'll land it here, but I just think those spaces are just so incredibly important right now, that you're able to build and to vision and to create with people like who are your like chosen family. And I just think it's really essential right now to make sure that we're surrounding ourselves and being in spaces that provide that level of comfort, and like being able to be seen, and just like being able to show up fully, in those ways, because I just think that we all work in certain systems and spaces where we're not always afforded that. And I just think so much of these creative processes gives you that opportunity. So it's a unique one. So any filmmaker watching this, I would just really lean into that idea of just like treating this like evolution of your work as so much of like, yes, this is something that you're creating, but like, what does that mean in terms of like how you're creating this, like with the crew and like with the team around you, and how that so much can be a form of like your own personal journey as well towards that. So yeah.
Thank you, Gary. That's beautiful. Jamie, Betty, is there anything you want to add?
I guess I would say, a huge lesson for me early on, and Gary kind of alluded to this as well, but really, so in the pandemic, I lost my job. I was a showrunner's assistant to a hotshot director, Emmy-winning person, and I was really, really down and out about having lost my job, and just being in a place where I didn't know. I basically had an existential crisis of like, who am I outside of my work? Who am I outside of my job title, outside of my salary, outside of what I'm producing and creating? And I think so often we are told that that is how we derive our value, right? Is from what we're creating, what we're making, what we're doing, what we're all these things. And so when we talk about like, the work that it is just to be, as you mentioned, Oanh-Nhi, right? Like that was a huge revolutionary concept for me, right? To like that I am worthy of love and respect and value just by being me, and not doing anything at all, right? Just like being who I am, and knowing the lived experiences I have, and the perspectives and the opinions that I bring to the table. And so I'd say like also for young filmmakers too, that the hustle, people can get really caught up in the hustle. And I think that rest is like just as revolutionary and just as critical and crucial to our work. because so often we haven't been given the opportunity to rest. We've been held to higher standards. We've been having to work twice as hard for, twice as long to get half as far, right? And so I think like part of that healing is also that rest, and also recognizing that when we do show up to those spaces that and this actually happens like right before this panel. I even said something along the lines of, oh yeah, I don't need to speak up like for every question. And Gary was like, Jamie, take the space. It's fine. And it's just a good reminder that like, yeah, take the damn space, like be who you are, show up. If you have something to say it. And as opposed to catering so much to the white audience or even just the white decision makers, like us showing up and being a little bit provocative, being a little bit noisy, is going to eventually center ourselves into those spaces without having to accommodate fragile identities. So I think that's like another key part. So it's a little bit both like, right, like rest and like recognize that you are who you are outside of your, what you're producing. But then also when you do hustle, like just take up that space and get noisy. Yeah.
If I can piggyback off of that, I love that, the sort of self-care piece. I think that we all, even during the pandemic, I was still stressed out about it. I'm like, I should be doing something. I'm not being useful. I mean, it stressed me stressed me out so much. I got really depressed because a lot of our work is really community engaged and being in community spaces with folks. Anyway, I do think that because we are all of us living in this capitalist society, we feel like we have to be like the hamster on that wheel, constantly going and producing. And what does that even mean? And so that pausing and stopping that we were all forced to do was really essential. But also, even in the last couple of years, just like kind of really slowing down and just thinking about the process of building relationships is so important. So maybe your camera's not constantly on, or I'm not photographing someone constantly, or quote unquote, producing some kind of cultural material, something tangible, but relationship building in and of itself is a part of that process. And for me, I have long-term relationships with folks that I've documented, or communities, like 5, 10, 15-year relationships with folks. Not that everyone has that luxury or that privilege of like that trust that you kind of carry with you along the way. But I think that is really, really important. So I consider myself also, like a cultural worker, right? And the cultural organizing. And I, a lot of the last 2 years, just to share briefly, last couple of years, the Chinatown community, Manhattan and in New York City, has been really kind of bifurcated and split in many ways. So when we talk about the community, we know it's not a monolith, right? What community are we talking about? And so the split really started to happen when, Peter Liang, who's a Chinese cop who was born and raised in Chinatown, killed a Black man in NYCHA government housing complex. And of course, the government never fixes the elevator or the lights in the stairway. And he was shot and killed by Peter Liang. And there was this huge split. And the group that I have been working with, CAB, Organizing Asian Communities, was the only Chinese New York City-based group that actually stood with Akai Gurley's family, the man who was shot. And you had 15 to 20,000 people marching, Chinese Americans marching for justice for Peter Liang, for this cop. Like this is our civil rights movement, right? Our like time to really speak up, right? And it was really disheartening. And I think it was a learning moment for us. And now that has carried on even now to the increase of anti-Asian violence. And we have a certain elites in the community, and even non-elite, regular folks who are calling for more policing, right? So I should say Asian, stop Asian hate to many of us has become synonymous with we want more increased policing. And we know that is only dividing our communities. And so learning from that, all that to say is that we really, with Chinatown Art Brigade, the group that I work with, and myself, kind of really shifting to doing some deep dive, some deep political education within ourselves and with some of our elders together, looking at the history of Black, Brown, and Asian, solidarity, collective liberation work that we've done, together, but also very concretely, what does community policing look like that is truly community policing, right? So it's been all, I think that pause, those conversations that have happened for over the last 5-6 years has been really, really important. It actually has brought some folks around from the community. So I think that work is just as important and valid, to be honest. Sometimes it's not just about turning on the camera and producing. So
I just want to like quickly say I love that this conversation has kind of dovetailed what I thought was going to be specifically around like nuts and bolts impact producing into more of just like this like really organizing, this like really beautiful intimate organizing space. And I think I just, again, we're here at PATH, and for like Asian folks having to kind of like, to Jamie's point, really kind of combat these really dangerous narratives around like model minority. I know myself, having worked in a lot of like nonprofits, I used to do a lot of like DEI work. It's just like it's really draining, and you kind of lose a sense of yourself. And so like I think so much about this like evolution around like identity forming and just how complex we are as humans. What I'll just say is find your people, find your tribe. And like I am so grateful, like kind of what you said in terms of what was a turning point. Like also a big turning point was like me finding like the mentors that like brought me under their wing and just like helped me kind of like see that and see kind of where my space was to be able to kind of take up and like my path forward. And I'm just so grateful for that. So I would just encourage anyone like listening to this session of just being able to like truly anchor yourself in that, of just like not only how complex, but like you deserve all of that. Like Jamie, like you take up all the space, like take up all the damn space, because like you belong there. Like let's combat like the model minority myth, model minority myth. Let's combat like imposter syndrome in terms of how we're navigating spaces, and make sure that you surround yourself with people that will lift you like completely all the way up, and we'll see you.
Yes. I love all that so much, like the care of like when you're creating something, like the intention with the care for each other, not like the outcome of what you're creating, is, I would say, is the more important to be honest, because like Betty goes back to the relationship building, the partnership building, that's like stems from years of relationship or not, but like able to see each other, able to heal in the process, and able to be not just the hustle bustle. I have all these questions here, but I don't know if I want to go to them, to be honest. But like, I guess as a filmmaker, like how do you stay grounded in those values? Like especially during the pandemic and racial reckoning, like how have you stayed grounded? I mean, Gary, I heard you said find your people, but just wonder if there's anything else that has kept you grounded as a filmmaker, as a human artist during this time. And if not, I can go to another question. Just let me know.
I just feel like I want to be mindful. I feel like I've been jumping in a lot, so I want to give other folks an opportunity to.
The reason why I was hesitant is because that's a tough question for me, to be honest. I can give like a canned answer that sounds really great, but to be real, it's been hard over the pandemic to stay grounded. To be real, there's been a lot of loss, and the sort of, when we talk about the dual pandemics of sort of racial justice and obviously the pandemic itself, on all ways, right? Like how our community, what's happening with the Asian American community, people I know who have been attacked, and how do we see people, but also try to really have like restorative conversations that are not just pointing fingers and sort of defaulting back to how Asians are sort of brainwashed and socialized in every way to uphold this white supremacy, state of white supremacy and anti-Blackness, and so I've been sitting with that a lot. Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've been very productive, and even with Zoom and being outside, we've in the last year, I'm sure we all have found creative ways to be with community and continue to produce. But yeah, this world is kind of screwed up right now, and I'm trying to reach for the thing that keeps me grounded. So anyway, that's kind of why, it's obviously my community and my nuclear family, as well as my chosen family of folks. But yeah, I struggle with that, just to be real.
Thanks, Betty. Gary, Jamie, anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I thank you, Betty, for sharing that. I think, it's easy for us to come in this space, be like, we got to figure it out. We're like leaning into like our self-care practices and, our community, but, we operate, and trying to challenge through a very white supremacist capitalist framework, both in our work and also our community. So it can be really hard. And just like I would just encourage myself too. I'm like talking to myself. It's just like listen to what your needs are, and how like fluid and ever changing they are. Like what you may need last week may change. And so I just think, I for me at least, I just try to root that in terms of just like really like deeply rooted abolitionist like frameworks in politics, in terms of just like making sure that I'm showing up for people and like reaching out for support. Also, just to like name it, if I'm being candid, like I think for me, like therapy has been massive as well, through this process, because these are not easy times. We are constantly like existing in like a virtual world, and this idea of like connection is becoming like greater as we continue to like navigate COVID. So yeah, there's not like a singular like answer to all of this, but I think that's okay. I think it's okay just to be like really honest, be like, no, I'm like not completely grounded because like shit's hard.
Exactly. Totally. And this reminds me too, at the beginning when we talked about like how being able to imagine and dream is so like crucial to us, especially when we're dealing with really hard circumstances. I'm just curious for each of you, like what stories do you wish you to see more, like moving forward, or like in your life? Like what's the story you really want to see?
We talk a lot about this at Culture House, in terms of the projects that we take on, the projects that we decide to pitch, and the projects that we decide to buy, et cetera. And, I think this has been a recurring thread throughout this conversation, but I think especially because we're experiencing such trauma over the last couple of years, and we're probably not even going to understand or comprehend the extent to that trauma until like decades into the future, when we look back and be like, oh my God, like really, this is like what we went through physically, spiritually, mentally, emotionally, and so for us, I mean, for me, I think personally and at Culture House, it's stories of joy, stories of unrequited joy. I mean, joy that's just like so unabashedly joyful, and I think so much, and I'm just going to take something from my colleague Carrie Twigg, who, she's biracial, with a Black father, white mother, and she often says that what she sees on screen about biracial people and children is this like trauma of being caught in the middle, of like not really identifying with one or the other, or feeling alienated by one or the other. And of course that exists 100%. That is a lived experience and lived reality. But her point is that that's the only thing she sees on screen, right? And so like, can we imagine a new way in which like that isn't a problem at all, right? And like, I think like Schitt's Creek does that beautifully with like, a gay relationship of just like, yeah, it's just like not even really even, there's no trauma involved, right? And so like, where can we find those stories and empower people to share those stories without any sort of shame, without any sort of guilt? And again, to the point of what everyone's been saying, it's like, how do we like re-envision what a world that we want to live in looks like? And we can do that by really being unabashedly joyful, right? So I think that's like a huge part of what I would like to see more on screen. And I'd like to see people disrupting the status quo, like just really like, people in roles and experiences that I would just have never seen otherwise, because that's the whole point of storytelling too, is being creative, being imaginative, So yeah, that's what I would say.
That's a great answer. I think at Working Films, we're constantly having to like wrestle with this idea of like how we can continue to be imaginative and revolutionary and radical in terms of our approach to like a lot of the films in which we support. And a big evolution as part of that is we really do believe that power emanates from the ground up. And it's just one thing to say it, but like what does it actually mean to put into praxis, right? And so for us, we've actually we've taken a big step and just thinking about like those who are proximate to like power, like so much around equity and kind of like shifting the landscape and like structural change is that redistribution of power and access and resources, right? And so for us as an institution where we are in this position where we can support filmmakers, last year through our Docs in Action program, our focus was around the prison industrial complex abolition and the abolition of the prison industrial complex. And so we actually had a process in which we brought partners on board. So we worked with Center for Political Education, MPD 150 based out of Minneapolis. We worked with Survived and Punished, as well as Center for or Survived and Punished, Critical Resistance, and then Center for Political Education. And so those partners helped us kind of design so much around like the messaging goals around what that call for media was going to look like. But then we took it a step further in terms of making sure that those directly impacted and working to address the issues, they know what's best for their communities and they should be the ones making decisions on the stories that are being told and what films are funded. And so for us as Working Films, we are really just trying to say like, what is our role in this? And so we actually took a step back and we actually removed ourselves from the decision-making process. We act as just really conveners and facilitators of that space. And so I think a big hope for me as we continue to move forward within like the documentary ecosystem that includes funders, that includes film festivals and programmers and distributors, is thinking about what areas in which we are proximate to power and how we may be able to see that either directly or ways in which we are just trying to be more accessible and equitable in our processes. And we make it a point for all of our applications is we provide feedback, right? Like we provide feedback in terms of what came up because we've all been on the opposite end of applying to different grants and not getting that and not knowing where your application fell short. And so just recognizing that like we are all in this like space together and how we can just like work to kind of create both like incremental but also like larger like scales of change that hopefully will just kind of work towards just like deeper equity that is actually changing the overall landscape. And so for us, we're really excited to be able to kind of shift that by removing ourselves from the decision-making process. I think for all of us, it was just like a big moment of like, trust, right? Like trust in like, you're building relationships with partners and like you like believe in them to be able to like make the decision. But we're just seeing so many beautiful things emerge from that around a lot of these like abolition partners being able to provide story consult and support for a lot of these filmmakers that are at like works in progress stage. And so it's an ongoing process, but we're just beginning to kind of see what that evolution can look like when this idea of like, decolonizing philanthropy actually comes into form, that like you're taking this idea of like removing your typical traditional like funding, like reporting, and you're doing this in a way that you're actually supporting filmmakers like through their entire process. And you're doing that also with additional partners that, are on board as well. So yeah, just thinking about it through that's what I think I'm really hopeful for, just seeing more like changes of how we are, changing decision making, how we are being more accessible and equitable and some of the things in which we hold.
Awesome answers. Yeah, I'll just add to that. I think that seeing more stories and films and art, media, culture, all of that, kind of reflecting our reality right now. And I think in terms of the last 2 years, what we've seen is incredible like mutual aid organizing and like cooperative sort of cooperative like mutuality, like principles of like mutuality, but also more specifically, I think a lot of folks are seeing through the nonprofit industrial complex, particularly around incarceration, particularly around the prison industrial complex. Like here in New York City, they want to build 4 new jails, right? And people and the nonprofits are completely bought into this. They're bought off, they're selling out, all this kind of stuff. So people are there's been a lot of organizing happening, alternative to the nonprofits, right? Really, really collectively driven kind of collective organizing that has been really beautiful to watch. So I think that seeing kind of figuring, and then that's happened all across the country around the rent, right? Rent strikes, rent moratorium, all that stuff. Not to say nonprofits, some are not, some of them have been on the right side of things, but I think moreover, stories that actually celebrate the victories, because I'm sick of, there's obviously, we know the pieces that I don't think any of us would be a part of, or part of encouraging or supporting, but the poverty porn, like this, poor little immigrant victim, right? The victimhood pieces. And it's like, people are agents of change. They themselves are agents of change. People are taking it into their own hands to change their circumstances collectively and organizing. And so it would be great to see more of these victories that I know are happening on housing, economic justice, around policing. Like, can we see that? Can we really see the stories and not just the one politician? Because we know that politician didn't make it happen. We know it's the community on the ground that made it happen. So that, I think, ties into the radical imagination. But that's grounded in real systemic change, but also grounded in our current conditions and honoring the painful past, right? Of like xenophobia and racism and all, slavery and indigenous, the past with reckoning with our past of how we've basically, not we, but the U.S. has annihilated, indigenous folks. But I mean, all of that to say that the radical imagination for me really needs to be grounded in some sense of like reality in a way too, so that there are lessons learned from this very, like, I think Jamie said it best, like, we're not going to really understand the impact until very 10 years out, right? Just in our communities with our close friends and family, the trauma, from this last couple of years around the reckoning and the pandemic. And so, yeah, so I would love to see those kind of stories emerge.
And I just want to quickly add here something that I think is really key for emerging filmmakers or filmmakers who are looking for financing or looking to pitch on this point is like, there's so many important issues and so many things that we're all working towards. And so when you are talking about your project, you need to be able to explain, like, why is your thing important now? Like, why is this the urgent moment for you to be telling this story and bringing in these voices at this particular moment? Because I think that is what also kind of sparks the like ongoing continued engagement in that particular issue, right? And so, like, if you can make that case, and I would say you can make that case for virtually anything, but like being able to do that in a really effective way can absolutely help bolster your case, And I think the why and the why now, and then also like, what is the specific journey you're actually taking us on? Like, what is the story you're taking this audience member on, like to really get embedded into this, world, this new world that you're creating. So anyways, I just wanted to add that based on what I've heard so far as well.
That's great. Thanks, Jamie. I was going to ask each of you, what would you like to leave our viewers with, your last sentence or two? So thank you, Jamie. But Betty and Gary, anything you want to share before we head out?
I just think on like a more or less kind of a practical level, this panel is around socially impactful films, and I can't recall how we decided that we were going to rename that, but just like finding the resources out there. Doc Society, they have a really great film impact guide toolkit. There's been a couple pieces around impact, and I just like, I've shared this so many times with folks, is that like, when I'm in certain spaces, like there's a real recognition that when like people are talking about impact, they're not talking about impact of like how I see it. And so, I think we run the risk of this work getting co-opted in terms of like what it means and like how it can look and feel. And I think specifically, whatever you can do to both find those resources in terms of what are the nuts and bolts around like impact producing, in terms of what it all entails and the different ways in terms of how you can be a strategist, either like from the film side, or you can be a community organizer, or an issue expert, whatever it looks like. Just like being able to just like root that within how you see change in the world, and not letting anyone else kind of take that from you. Because again, I hear people, impacts become such a sexy thing, and how we're talking about it. And it's just like, I don't think everyone's like speaking the same language in terms of how we're doing that. So just find the resources. Global Impact Producers Listserv is a great resource. Cecilia Mahaya put out a really great piece from Filmmaker magazine around impact producing. So there's a lot of resources out there. And I also just want to say, if anyone wants to ever reach out to me to kind of just like talk through it, like my inbox is open. If you want to connect, I'd be happy to talk through just like impact work.
Such awesome practical advice. Anyone out there should definitely take Gary up on that, because Working Films does really, really great work. It's, for me, it's more general. I just think that just, you know, and I say this, anything I say, you know, to the ether, I don't know who's like watching, but I would say to myself, which is just kind of stay focused. I mean, I think that oftentimes we forget our end goal of why we're making something, whatever creative project it is that you're embarking on, particularly social justice minded projects, and that find your people. Yeah, find your people. And that means on every end of it. So on your production team, as well as the folks who you'll be working with closely, and don't, you know, shy away. Don't be resistant to what the community has to, like, community members have to offer. Because I know for me, during feedback sessions or working with various collectives, they sometimes have the most like insightful ideas that I've never even thought of. And there's things I've just scratched completely. And to have that ear on the ground, and to really be open to that shifting, and that, you know, yeah, you have a plan, but also be flexible to that plan. I just always treat every situation as a learning moment, like here now. I'm learning so much from you all, and just kind of that openness, because a lot of this kind of work, you just can't have a predetermined like end of what your story arc will be, right? It could change, and be open to that. So I know it sounds a little bit like nebulous, but I think that, you know, trusting your gut, but also remembering the principles of accountability, mutuality, and as much as you can really be in touch with folks who you're documenting and that you're working with, and that you build that trust. That's like the foundation in any project that you work on that is a community-minded film or any kind of creative project. So that's what I can offer.
Yes, thank you so much, everybody. Everybody follow Jamie Wu, Betty Yu, Gary Leonard. Find them on Instagram, Facebook, wherever you all are. But thank you so much for your time and your brilliance and wisdom. So appreciate being in this space with you. And thank you, everybody, for watching.
Thank you, Oanh-Nhi, for wonderfully moderating. This was fabulous. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, awesome job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Got me feeling lonely. Need an escape. So tell me, is this love? I think I'm getting